All right, yeah, I guess Montreal's not that far away, but Execution Labs is based in Montreal. We're an early stage investor in games, and because of that, we tend to do a lot of stuff around business, entrepreneurship, funding, pitching, and we work with many, many studios, not just from Montreal, but the rest of Canada and also elsewhere in the world. We've done about 20 investments, or 25 actually, investments in studios so far, and it's been an interesting process to sort of really focus on the business side of games. And so I guess, you know, this is the sort of warning. Does this even work? It's working? So this is the warning that this is a business-oriented talk. I mean, I think there's been you know, sort of a challenge sometimes when I talk about these businessy things is that in no way does it mean to discredit the value of just creating, right? Making games as expression, sort of using games as your canvas to paint, you know, that speaks to the power of games, and that's wonderful and amazing. But, you know, if you actually want to make money and build a business, then that's a whole other sort of discussion. So this is the warning that this is a business-oriented talk. So the first sort of tip, I guess, in that regard is a great game is the starting point, right? So all of the stuff that I'm going to say about pitching and business and entrepreneurship and all that kind of money-oriented stuff is irrelevant if your game is crap, right? If you have a crappy game, then no amount of good pitching and marketing is really going to help you. That the starting point is making a good game. So as a developer, then, you know, half your work is making the great game. The other half of the work is the business side of things, and really making the great game is, you know, the starting point of all of that. So, you know, so when we're talking about entrepreneurship, there's a lot of memes and sort of fun little quotes, all kinds of stuff on the internet. And so these are just a couple of fun ones, sort of, you know, speaking about I mean, not necessarily about games, but just sort of entrepreneurship in general. This one I like, you know, we're talking about startups, you know, where you don't know who your customers are or what your product is or how you're going to make money. Or this one I thought was kind of cute. Anyway, so all kinds of fun stuff about entrepreneurship. But in terms of sort of the textbook definition of entrepreneurship, you know, setting up and operating a business, obviously that's an obvious one. You know, doing so in a context of high risk and uncertainty, you know, so that should be pretty familiar to most game developers. And the third one, you know, intention to make profit, I think that's the one where a lot of developers forget about that one, right? They're sort of dealing with uncertainty, they're trying to operate a business, but they forget that if they're, you know, for their business, they're supposed to make profit, or at least intend to make profit. And so I like to parse or think about indies across two spectrums. To me, an indie is anyone or any company that has creative freedom, right? So you can work on the things that you want to work on, and has legal independence, meaning you're your own company. You're not a division or a subsidiary of some mega corporation. So if you have creative freedom and legal independence, then you are an indie. But now we can sort of parse those indies across this sort of matrix between commercial intent and vision. Vision is sort of my catch-all term for, you know, you're doing some worthwhile work, meaningful, innovative, creative work, sort of is quote-unquote vision. So this is where you put the proverbial sort of starving artists, right? They're doing visionary work. They're doing something creative, interesting, meaningful, but they're not really intending to make a profit. It's sort of not in their mindset. They're just doing cool stuff. They're creating interesting stuff. Up here is where I would call the sellouts. So this is everyone making a Clash of Clans clone or a Candy Crush clone or you know, some clone of something that's doing well. So you know, they want to make money. They say, look at all the money Clash of Clans is making. I'm going to make a clone of that. I'm going to make all the monies. But it's not particularly interesting, right? Because they're just sort of copying someone else. So they're not really doing visionary work. They're still indie. Even if you're making a match 3 game, you're still indie, right? You're still legally independent. You still have creative freedom. You're choosing to make a match 3 game. You're intending to make money. Doesn't mean you will, but you're not particularly visionary. The folks down here are just lost, right? You know, they're not doing particularly interesting work. and also they're not really intending to make money. Now, admittedly, that could be students or recently graduated folks, sort of amateurs that are still finding their way, and so they'll likely kind of migrate into one of the other quadrants, although some folks kind of stay lost for a while. And then here is what I would call the indie entrepreneurs. So these are folks that are doing interesting, innovative, meaningful, creative, cool work, but are doing so in the context of commercial intent. As an investor, I only care about those indies in terms of who I'm going to invest in. Now, that's not to say, well, particularly in the starving artist zone, that there's not interesting stuff being done, but that's not a relevant quadrant from a business point of view, because they're not even intending to make money. So as an investor, as a business person, I'm looking at that upper right quadrant, innovative, interesting, meaningful work in a context of commercial intent. So who are these people? Some examples. Tanya Short from KitFox, one of the studios we invested in a few years ago. Tanya, by nature is more of a designer, more of a creative person, but really takes on that responsibility of being the captain of the studio, worrying about marketing and PR and community building and pitching publishers and so on. So really, trying to do their meaningful work, but also trying to succeed commercially. Rami, everyone knows Rami. No one would sort of debate that the work that they do is really cool and innovative and artistic. But Rami is a real hustler. I mean, he's one of the best sort of salesperson around, even though you don't see him that way because he's such a sort of a community-oriented person. More nearby here, Nathan Vella from Cappy, right? Capybara, no one would deny that the work that they do is really cool, really innovative, artful games, but at the same time, Nathan is a very shrewd business person, was also the co-founder or founding partner of the Indie Fund, so doing really smart things on the business side. Genova Chen, right? Creator of Journey, Flow, Flower. I mean, Journey is a masterpiece, but at the same time, Genova is a killer business person, right? Coming out of school, they had a 3-project contract with Sony. They got millions of dollars from Silicon Valley investors. Really, really smart decisions. But at the same time, the work that they do is super visionary and creative. Jonathan Blow, everyone knows Jonathan, and of course Tim Schafer, also, doing visionary work, but at the same time in the context of commercial intent. So the second tip really is to embrace this entrepreneurial identity. I think a lot of developers struggle with that. We've seen it ourselves, where they feel like there's pressure to be a starving artist and suffer for your craft, and that's the only way you can do visionary work. But clearly, that's not the case, right? It's not binary. It's not I'm a sellout or I'm a starving artist. There is more nuance to it, and there is this kind of category of independent entrepreneur, and we've seen just a couple of examples of that. So really, you have to embrace what it means to be an entrepreneur. Another example, this is Richard Atlas. He's the co-founder of Clever Endeavors, a studio in Montreal that, in fact, we did not invest in, but we looked at. They did Ultimate Chicken Horse. Huge success on Steam last year. I think they're up past 250,000 copies sold. They had a successful Kickstarter. They're doing great on Steam. They also were nominated for an IGF Design Award at GDC this year. I mean, for essentially a couple of kids, I mean, it was their first studio, their first game. None of them had worked in a game studio before. So really rookie team. Phenomenal success for your rookie effort. So big kudos to them. But for Richard, he knew he wanted to build a business, right? He wasn't just coming at it saying, I like to make games, I want to make games, how can I make games? He had all of that, but at the same time, he also said, I realize I need to make a company, build a business, have a team, and think about marketing and the product and which platforms I'm on, et cetera, et cetera. And so in that sense, it was intentional, right? He didn't make a company by accident. He didn't build a business by accident. He did it intentionally. Another example that comes to mind are the co-founders of Riot. So Brandon, Mark I don't know so well. Brandon's a friend of mine from way back. I remember when Brandon was first pitching League of Legends. So Riot didn't exist, and he had this idea that this sort of MOBA style game, competitive, he saw other ones in the market that weren't quite satisfying him, and so he thought there was a real opportunity. And he has a finance background. I mean, he's a passionate gamer, all that, but he sort of built Riot with the intent to create this MOBA that he believed could capture a sizable chunk of the market. Now, he couldn't imagine at that point how big, in fact, League of Legends would become. I mean, no one would sort of predict that scale of success, but he had that intent. He had the intent to sort of capture that audience, capture that part of the market, when they were building Riot. And so, in that sense, I think there's a lot of difference between the notions of uncertainty or by accident, right? It's one thing for Brandon to say, I think there's a market for MOBAs, and if I look at the competitors, I believe I can capture a portion of that and build a successful business, but I'm uncertain. It may or may not happen. That's different to do it by accident, which would have been more like, I like MOBAs, I'm going to make a MOBA, and let's see what happens, right? And we just sort of throw it out into the world because, well, why not? And that's kind of more by accident. And so, to me, that sort of is the difference between intentionality, right? Brandon had the intent of doing what he did, and succeeded, versus hope, which is, we're just going to make this thing and throw it out there, and we hope we succeed. Now, of course, having the intent to succeed doesn't necessarily mean you actually will succeed, but it's a much different proposition than just sort of going blindly at it, hoping by accident you succeed. And so in that sense, the next tip is be intentional, right? Don't be accidental. Really think about what it is you're trying to achieve and be intentional about the decisions that you're making as a developer, as an entrepreneur, as a business. So that sort of leads me to think about the concept of local maxima. I remember Will Wright, a famous game designer, at GDC, gave a keynote many, many years ago, and he talked about the concept of local maxima more so in relation to what he called the opportunity space of gameplay or game design. So he was thinking about this sort of, you had all these sort of design choices to make, and how would you know which design was the best design or which gameplay elements were the best gameplay elements, and sort of he just was talking about this notion of local maxima, but I'm sort of appropriating that and thinking in the context of what games you work on, right? And so I think the challenge is that many developers start making a game, whether it's a MOBA or whatever, a shooter or strategy game, without necessarily understanding what the maxima or what the potential of that game is, right? So if you look at the little humps, think of that as market opportunity, right? And so let's say the small hump, for example, would be a couch co-op game, right? A local multiplayer only game, which generally those games don't sell well because it implies I have friends and that I have 4 controllers and that I have a sofa in my home. And so the context usually of a couch co-op game or a party game is they generally don't sell that well. Whereas maybe the taller hill, maybe that's a racing game or a MOBA or something where the potential is much higher. And so one of the sort of traps as a developer is you kind of pick couch co-op game, so you're going to climb the small hill, but the local maxima of that hill is so tiny. So no matter how amazing you are and how kick-ass your couch co-op game is, the likely potential opportunity is just the small hill. So you're optimizing for a local maxima that's sort of not the right opportunity, or you're climbing the wrong hill. And so the challenge is you don't know that until you get to the top of the hill. Because when you're starting, you don't see the peaks, right? You're starting at the base of each hill, and each base is, I don't know, it's like obfuscated by clouds, so the cloud of war. So you're at the base of the hill, so let's do this hill and let's start climbing. And so part of that then requires that you do market research or competitive analysis, right? And think about marketing like business people or entrepreneurs might actually do. So one of the things we do with our teams often is the notion of competitive analysis and looking at other games in the space that you want to tackle. But it's also understanding that marketing is more than PR, right? Famously, there's 4 Ps, the 4 Ps of marketing. One of them is promotion, which captures PR advertising, right? So that's not the end of marketing, that's only part of it. The other is price. So determining, what business model, what price point, all that stuff is part of marketing, right? Which means you're supposed to think about it relative to the audience, relative to the market, relative to the business. The other is place. In the context of game, place really means platform, I suppose, or which distribution channels you're using. Are you going to put it on mobile, Steam, or the Xbox, or or regional distribution, et cetera. And the fourth P is product. So thinking about the product is actually part of the marketing process, which means you have to think about your game as a product that's entering a market that has an audience. Who is that audience? How am I going to reach them? What's the maximum potential of that audience? If I look at other similar games, what size of the market have they captured? All that kind of stuff. So I mean, with Steam Spy, App Annie, other tools, it's not impossible to find those answers. And so while, I don't want to suggest that you want to build games by sort of spreadsheet, but if you're going to start a studio or you're thinking about the next project for your studio, do a little bit of work, homework, to say, oh, we had an idea to do a couch co-op game. How are those games selling? What, the ones that have done well, how well have they done? The ones that have done poorly, how poorly have they done? Why has the good ones done good? Why have the bad ones done badly? Do a little bit of that homework before you just sort of dive in kind of by accident and hope for the best. Anyway, so the next tip leading off of that is, don't get stuck on a local maxima by accident, right? Don't start climbing the little hill, having no clue that it's a tiny little hill, before you start climbing. All right. So related to that then is the notion of failure, right? Because you're going to climb a bunch of these hills because you won't heed my advice and do your homework, and you're going to fail a whole bunch. But that's part of the industry, right? And so there's so many stories about failure. This is one that I like because the headline is so dramatic. That's Iran Argosy and Alex Rogopoulos, the co-founders of Harmonix. This article's from like 10 years ago or something, or what year is it? 2009. So this is an old article, but where it talked about 10 years of failure before they hit success, which of course all of you should recall that they're the ones who made Guitar Hero and then Rock Band, at the time both billion-dollar franchises. We won't talk about how Activision screwed that all up, but anyways, the point being was the article talks how they suffered, they failed, they had all this sort of dead ends that they hit in a 10-year history, before becoming an overnight success with Rock Band and Guitar Hero. And so there's many stories like this. I mean, famously now, Angry Birds, we all know the story, where they made 50 games or 51 games, they almost went broke. They sketched a bunch of stuff. They came up with Angry Birds, and kind of Rovio became an overnight success. I mean, I've been in the game industry 20 years. I don't even know what a single one of those 51 other games are. I don't know if anyone else. Like, I just have no clue. Nobody cares. Nobody knows. Anyways, so failure is actually an important part of the process. I remember there was a developer that was pitching to us, and they were experienced developers. They were veteran developers that mostly had worked in AAA. And they really had a great sort of resume, all together, so many years in the industry with working on all these big franchises and so on. And they said they're going to come and revolutionize mobile. They have all these killer ideas to make mobile games better. But I looked at their sort of pitch deck and their info, and there wasn't a single mention of having worked on any mobile games at any mobile studios, nothing. And so I said, listen, guys, I mean, you've done great work at other studios, but if you want to come in and sort of, upend the mobile space and you have zero experience in mobile, I mean, that's a major, major red flag. And they're like, oh, no, we've worked at other studios, but we worked on other mobile games, but they weren't great, so we feel like they were failures, so we didn't include it in the info because we're not proud of those games and those. I'm like, no, listen, like I like to see that there's failure there. To me, that's education that I didn't have to pay for. And I'm telling you, it was an immediate red flag that there was no mention of mobile at all. I almost should have just tossed your stuff in the trash, thinking it was irrelevant. So this notion of kind of embracing failure as part of an educational process is actually quite important. So how many folks have read The Lean Startup? All right, not enough of you. Everyone in the room should read the Lean Startup. I mean, it's a great book on entrepreneurship, on sort of the learning process of discovering, what you should be working on. And I mean, whatever. I'm not doing a good job explaining, but it's a great book. One of the key sort of quotes is to succeed, you have to accelerate the rate of learning, right? So the whole sort of point of the book is what he called the build, measure, learn loop, right? That we always have these assumptions about what's going to work, and we're usually wrong. So the point is to get something in the hands of the users or the players as quickly as possible so they can tell you whether you're right or wrong. And that whether you fail or succeed, it's worth the same, right? Like if the player plays your thing and says, this is crap, like that knowledge is just as valuable as them telling you, this is great, right? Because then that forces you to go fix, and why was it crap, and you adjust. So failure or negativity is neutral. It's just more data. And so as a startup or as an indie, you should be focused on your ability to accelerate your process of learning, which means quick iterations, being agile, getting stuff into users' hands, thinking about user experience and UX and user play testing, all that kind of stuff. Because at the end of the day, despite all of our skills, we tend to sort of, whatever. We need real data and real input from users. And so in many ways, the Lean Startup, although not presented in this way, is your manual to fail efficiently. And I say that in the most sort of positive and valuable of ways. But so who thinks this way? Supercell, right? Supercell, the whole company is built around the notion of small, agile, nimble cells working on projects, that they have autonomy, that they can kill stuff. Anyone on the team can kill something, right? It's all based on input from real users, data-driven. This company is making billions of dollars, and the games are pretty fun as well. But this sort of notion of failure is neutral, failure is part of the learning process. Building a system that allows them to learn quickly and kind of let go of the failures, right? It's like, okay, we tried something, we put it in the hands of users, it's not working, all right, we're just gonna dump it, we're gonna move on to something else. And so this is the next tip, is then don't fall into the sunk cost trap, right? I think that like this is one of the biggest psychological traps of human beings in general, and I think it's especially true of game developers, that once you start building something, you never want to let it go because of the time and resources and effort you put into that. But if you realize it's not going to go anywhere, you have to sort of abandon it. And that was important learning to then go on to the next thing. Which then sort of speaks to the notion of vision, right? A lot of studios, a lot of developers don't think long term. They're not thinking about the vision of their studio, never mind the sort of the vision of the game. And so that brings up the concept of scaffolding. We often talk about scaffolding with our teams, and to me, scaffolding is sort of all the sort of support structures you're building that allows you to kind of build your empire, to build your great studio. And that requires a roadmap. It requires a vision of where you want to go as a studio. And one of the trick questions we use when developers are pitching us is we ask them, what does their third game look like? And if they can't answer what the third game in their roadmap is, it means they don't have a roadmap. And to us, that's problematic, because you should be making choices and decisions on game one that will allow you to make game 2 better and faster, that will allow you to make game 3 better and faster, and so on. Now, that I don't mean sequels, but I mean in terms of design philosophy, in terms of the people you're hiring, in terms of the tools and tech that you're using in building, should somehow sort of answer to a longer term vision. I mean, I'll use KitFox as a reference. They believe strongly in procedural generation. So the first game they made, Shattered Planet, was a sort of a much smaller scale mobile game, and it had procedural level generation and so on. So they built certain Unity plugins, and they had done a bunch of research, and I think they hired one of their programmers, had some expertise in procedural generation. So they're sort of building some mass around this notion of procedural generation. So then when they worked on Moon Hunters, they had all that base to start from. Now, Moon Hunters is a completely different game. It looks completely different. It's on Steam and console. it's an absolutely different game, but underneath, in the guts, all of the stuff that Kit Fox had learned and tested and tried and built for Shattered Planet, that became the starting point for Moon Hunters. Whereas if they said, okay, we can do all this procedural stuff on Shattered Planet, okay, and now we're going to do a trading card game on Xbox, like you're essentially resetting. If you're not thinking about that long-term vision, if you don't have the vision, then you can't make those choices. But the vision also has to do with, when it comes time to pitch yourself. So there was another studio, a crazy veteran, like 20-year veterans, had worked at the big AAA companies, and they were just, for the first time, going to go independent. And they built a whole pitch deck to go to GDC, and it was all about this kind of cool project they were working on. And I asked them, and I said, well, listen, hold on a second. Are you looking for investors for the project, or are you looking for investors in the company? Because there was there's something off about the pitch. And they're like, oh, well, no, we want to get investment in the company because we have this roadmap and longer-term vision of the kinds of things that we're doing. And I'm like, well, why do you give me 50 pages about, the monster designs and core mechanics? Like, how am I going to make a decision to invest in you and your company if you flooded me with weapon designs and, stuff about the game? And they're like, well, but I thought that's what pitches, like I thought I pitched the game. Like, no, you have to pitch yourself and the studio and your track record and your vision for the studio. And he's like, oh, I didn't think it. So I'm like the deck was really 50 pages, and the only thing about the company was the logo. And the other 49 pages was like all the game stuff. And I said, give me a deck that's 10 pages, 10 slides, and 1 page is about the game. And they almost fell out of their chairs. I said, that's my challenge to you, right? The rest should be about who you are, the vision, the roadmap for the studio, the kinds of games you want to be building, what the market potential is, and then one game, tell me it's, I don't know, unicorns in space or something on 1 page. That's all I need to know. And anyway, so it was a bit flabbergasting for them, but so point is, know your vision before you go out and hustle. And this is one of the biggest mistakes that studios make, right? So they went into GDC and sort of flipped their pitch around and said, okay, all right, we're going to pitch us as a studio and our vision as opposed to pitching the game. That changes who you pitch to, and there's all kinds of sort of ramifications for that. But all right, so moving on. When it comes to pitching or selling, there's really sort of 2 things you're selling. You're either selling your revenue or you're selling proof. And I'll explain what that means. We normally call that the sizzle versus the steak, right? Either you're selling the sizzle, meaning it's the long-term vision, the potential of what you'll achieve, all the sort of buzz and hype around what you're doing because of who you are, or you were at the IGF and won an award, something. So you're selling the buzz, you're selling the sizzle. And that generally means you're not yet generating revenue, right? Maybe you have a prototype that sort of got you into some of the festivals and so on, but you're selling the buzz. And someone has to believe that you can deliver on that potential. That's a much different pitch or a much different sales proposition than I'm generating revenue, I've got meat on the bones, there is steak to sell, and then they're looking at you from a very sort of banker type of modality where they're looking, okay, what's your revenue stream and what's your forecasted revenue, all this kind of stuff. And then they're like poking at the meat, right? They're like poking at the steak and saying, how much meat is there? And we're going to buy based on, how much meat there is on the bones. And it's much more factual. So if you're ever out there pitching, depending who you're pitching, understand which mode you're in. Are you pitching your sizzle or are you pitching your steak? At the same time, there's also this concept of sort of falling into the river, right? We get pitches often from developers who will say, listen, I'm making this thing, cool team, whatever, and my burn is, I don't know, whatever, 20 grand a month, 10 grand a month. And I just want to work on it for 6 more months. So give me, 50 grand and I'll keep working for 6 months more. And to me, that is the recipe for building the bridge into the middle of the river, right? Which like is completely useless, right? Why are we going to build a bridge to the middle? We might as well not build it at all, right? And so as an investor, as a publisher, investor, whatever, I have to know that your plan gets you to the other side of the river. Now, there might be corrections along the way, but don't tell me, I'm just going to work for another year and see where I get, because that to me is going to get you nowhere. And so really, investors want to see that the funding gets you to the next point. And so in that way, I think of funding much more as a rally, sort of checkpoint to checkpoint. So oftentimes, you have to be able to know what your checkpoints are. And so that might be, okay, we're getting started from nothing. Then the next checkpoint is, call it the prototype. Then the next checkpoint is, I don't know, early access, depending on what kind of game you're making. And so if you come to me and say, listen, I've got this great team, we're ready to go, we need a bit of funding to kind of build the prototype, here's the vision, whatever, then okay, all right, I'll give you the money you need to get to the prototype. But, or you have the prototype, okay, the prototype's cool, now I'll give you the money you need to get to early access, or whatever the sort of the next checkpoint is. But that's how the investors are thinking. I mean, on the mobile side, it's normally, get to soft launch, or in soft launch KPIs, then get to global launch, et cetera. But we're really thinking checkpoint to checkpoint. And so when you are doing your own planning, you have to understand what your checkpoints are. Because 6 more months of doing stuff is not a valid checkpoint, right? That's not a valid milestone. And so, what is your next checkpoint? And so in that sense, when you're doing your budgeting or when you're thinking about funding, you really have to think about, what are those checkpoints? What are those key proof points? And those are the stages that you'll get funding to get to, or that you'll get funding from, right? And so normally the way investors work is, if I'm funding you on the first checkpoint, it's because I think there'll be other people to give you bigger money at the next checkpoint, right? And so let's say, I don't know, this is a whole other lecture on funding stages, but let's say you get some money from your friends and family to get to the prototype. Well, they're giving you the money because they love you, but they also hope that, when you get to the prototype, then you can go get some angel money. And the angels are giving you the money at the prototype stage because they believe once you get to early access, you'll get a publisher deal. So each person that's giving you money now is thinking ahead to the next checkpoint and saying, will someone else give them money, or will they get success at that next checkpoint? I mean, they may not verbalize it like that, but anyways, that's kind of what's going on. But in that sense, I mean, you do have to deal with people. And Nathan Della and Chris from Cappy gave a great lecture, I think it was the IGDA Montreal, it was like a long time ago, 10 years ago. And the title of the lecture was Beer with Friends. And it's actually, I think it's still online. If you search for Cappy Beers with Friends, I think you'll find it. And I said, well, that's a silly name for a business lecture. But essentially, he talked about the need to sort of make business more human, right? That connecting with people, doing business with people you like, going out to events. This was a photo we took after PAX, I think it was the first PAX East, actually. And sort of, business is a long-term relationship. One of the mistakes we often see is, developers will be busy developing, and then one day they realize, oh crap, we need some money. And so then they come out of their cave and say, who are those people with the money? Let's go find them. Hey, do you have some money for me? I need it now. Right, yeah, right now. I need it right now. And we're not prepared. Like we want to be courted. We have to flirt a bit. It takes time. We want to see you at a couple of shows. And so, even publishing deals, it usually takes, I mean, if you're lucky, 3 months, but it's more like 6 months. It's more like next year. Like, it's just a long, drawn-out process. I mean, one of the projects we're working on now, we first started pitching at E3 last summer, and we only just received a term sheet from one of the investors like a couple weeks ago. So that's like a 9-month plus process just to kind of, seduce the initial. Anyway, so it always takes way longer. And so when you're doing your business planning, you have to think ahead. Okay, if I need funding 12 months from now for that next checkpoint, I need to right now be going out to events like this, to MIGS, GDC, whatever, make relationships, meet people, network, mingle, because I have to build up that sort of trust, that recognition, be talking to folks for a much longer period of time. So one of it is timing, but so the next tip really is just to make business human, and building those relationships on all sort of different levels of the industry is super, super critical. All right, so moving on then. This is Eric Zimmerman, a good friend of mine, and his wife, Natalie, who's an architect. But Eric Zimmerman famously wrote Rules of Play, one of the best game design books. Very famous designer. Eric is well known as being a designer, but he's also a really savvy business person. And he ran a studio called Game Lab out of New York for many years, and was making indie games and casual games before we even called them indie games or casual games. One of the famous ones that came out of Game Lab was Diner Dash, the first Diner Dash, but did many, many games. So one of the things I always liked about Eric was he had his foot in so many different areas, right? He, in academia, in the art world, the cultural scene, in film, in music. I mean, at his core, he was a designer, a game designer, but he was always sort of inspired and fascinated by all these other things. And I think he brought that into his design vision and made his work much more inspired. But he also sort of did that from a business point of view. And I think we sort of don't often look enough, right? So I mentioned the Lean Startup as books is just one area. I read a lot of books, but there's a ton of stuff out there, ton of great books about being a startup, about entrepreneurship, about pitching, innovation, all this kind of stuff. So many great books. Art of the Start, for those who are just starting out and sort of building their independent studio, I recommend Art of the Start. Has nothing to do with games, but it's sort of a really nice sort of a 101 level book for business and entrepreneurship. There's the whole startup world and other pitch days and conferences on entrepreneur. There's so much stuff out there that we shouldn't be so xenophobic that if the book doesn't say game business or game pitches or game whatever, we shouldn't be afraid of it. This one here, Venture Deals. If you believe you're going to go talk to angels and VCs, read this book first. You'll feel like a ninja. Super, super valuable book. Anyway, so there's this is one I'm reading now, Art of Strategy. There's just a ton of knowledge, and I think the biggest sort of takeaway there is don't rely on first principles from a business point of view, right? So it's very rare today that we would rely on first principles from a development point of view. It's like, hey, how do you code? Let's figure this out. Or how do we, you read a book, you watch a GDC video, you talk to your peers, right? You don't rely on the knowledge that's just in your head and sort of your gut instinct. You go out in the world and you accumulate understanding and knowledge and references and inspiration, from a development and design point of view. So why do we rely on first principles from a business point of view or marketing point of view? Read some books, talk to your peers, look to other industries for inspiration. That's part of your job now if you want to be an entrepreneur. All right, I think this is the last one. Folks know who these guys are? The BioWare guys, yeah. Jeez, didn't the Mass Effect just come out? But they retired, so maybe that's why. So that's Ray and Greg, co-founders of BioWare. Yeah, well, it's just showing our age, Chris, because I remember when they were just getting started up in Edmonton, and we had a very early build of Baldur's Gate and stuff. Anyways, great guys. Massive success. Great games. They sold their company twice over. I think once for about $1 billion to EI. It was ridiculous, right? Just so much success. But the nicest guys, and really, everything they were focused on was about the development process, the culture of development, the creative process, building great games. And this is sort of the whole independent entrepreneur, right? Doing visionary stuff, but at the same time, doing so in a commercial context. But the point here is that they were the most humble guys around. Just the nicest, well, they were Canadian, like most of us here, so kind of by default, they were nice people. But despite all of their success, they were just the nicest people. And if you saw them at a conference, they were always, willing to give some advice. Or if you had a critique, they were always willing to listen. And, really, and Ray often talked about the need for humility, right? That sort of being cocky or proud or having a big ego is just not conducive to doing good stuff. So maybe as a final tip, this word "ambitious," which comes from Brandon, that particular term comes from Brandon at Riot, where he said, as entrepreneurs, we need to be humble. We need to have that humility. We need to know that we have things to learn and go and seek help and support and knowledge, but we also need to be ambitious. We have to have a little bit of that craziness to believe that we can conquer the world and do amazing things. And so that kind of almost paradoxical combination of humility and ambitiousness, this sort of ambitious, to me was sort of perfectly portrayed by Ray and Greg, and I thought it was a cool term. So as a sort of a final tip, throughout all of this, still have that mindset of ambitiousness. And with that and all those tips, hopefully you'll go out there and be awesome indie entrepreneurs. Thank you very much. We have Q. Yeah, I'll take it. All right, so we have a little bit of time for questions. If anyone wants to kind of critique particular things or ask other questions on pitches and funding and entrepreneurship. No, they're all scared. Everyone's scared. Yeah, I mean the pitching side of things, is often something we do a lot of work on, and I think it's easy for people to kind of almost sort of place pitching and business in this kind of other thing, right? It's like, I'm a game developer, I'm gonna go make my games, and the pitch, that's some other thing that I feel dirty doing, or on these rare occasions I have to put a suit on, even if it's sort of just figuratively to go pitch. And I think, obviously, I think that's really the wrong way to look at it, but more importantly, pitching or coming up with your pitch is important for you to really understand what is it you're actually building. And so part of the reason developers generally suck at pitching is because they cannot articulate what they're doing, right? And so when people ramble on for 5 pages about their combo weapon mechanics, I'm like, this person has no clue what they're doing, right? And it's in some ways it feels safe for the individual. So I'm just going to go deep on this thing that I know really well, but then we don't actually know like what is this thing you're building, and what's the the vision of the game, and so on. And so it's sort of a good acid test for you to properly understand what it is that you're doing, and the ability to pitch and to sort of articulate that essence is not just when you have to be sleazy to go pitch some investors, but it's also super valuable when you're at a place like this and you have to you're sitting next to someone and say, oh hey, what are you working on, right? You can't talk for 20 minutes about your combo weapon mechanics. You need to be able to quickly and succinctly say what it is that you're doing. Or when you're on the floor at the expo and you're having 1,000 people come by your booth, you can't stop with each one of them and talk for 20 minutes about combo mechanics. You have to sort of quickly, the whole elevator pitch stuff. When you're talking to press, you have to be succinct. When you're talking to potential people you want to hire, partners, let's say you bump into the person from Unity and you need some help from Unity, you want to get the person from Unity excited about what you're doing so they'll help you out. You have to pitch them even though you're not asking them for money. So this ability to kind of pitch and think succinctly about what it is you're doing is not just for investors and publishers, but it's also for your peers, it's for press, it's for potential partners and support entities and stuff like that. So we put a lot of emphasis on the pitching ability. But it's not just the sort of the sleazy part. It's really kind of this more holistic approach. But anyways, so Jill, I guess, oh, she left the room. So no questions? Oh, yes, go ahead. Well, I will have to admit that I didn't see Ben's lecture. Sorry, man. I was on the other side of the glass. So Ben, maybe you can comment. Do you see the things that I'm saying as sort of opposed to what Ben was more of a gentleman and sat in for my lecture.
We didn't stray away from things that we knew would make sense in that regard either. Like we focused on making a VR game because we were interested in supporting VR, but we knew a lot of people weren't going to have headsets, and if we wanted to have any measure of financial success, we should probably support non-VR as well. So that was an instance of we were still interested in pursuing our starving artist dream, but we were realistic in knowing where most of the users were, for instance, and so we targeted non-VR as well because it just made sense.
Right. So that's an example of an intentional choice. And I think,
I mean, it's a good question in the sense that, you know, at the start, you should be asking yourself, what is our intent? Are we doing this because, you know, this is our canvas and we just want to enjoy the painting, and then whatever happens, it doesn't matter because I enjoyed the process of painting? And this is sort of more the starving artist approach. Now, starving artists can accidentally become very successful because someone saw your masterpiece and all of a sudden, you know, it sells 1 million copies. So you may accidentally, you know, become successful from a financial point of view. And so I think that, you know, that's why I made the warning at the beginning, in that the things that I'm saying here are specifically in the context of you sat around the table and said, let's make a company, let's build a business because we believe there's an opportunity to generate revenue and pay salaries and, you know, make a kind of a go of creating a business. But even if you do that choice, you still have to make great games. Right? You can't say, let's go build a business and we'll just sort of shovel crap to people, because the market's just not going to accept that. So that's my sort of definition of an independent entrepreneur, is you're doing visionary work, creative, interesting work, but you're trying to do it in a sense that, like, we're going to build a successful business. Because the reverse generally doesn't work, where it's like, let's just do cool stuff and ignore everything else and hope by accident we have some success. Your chances there are much lower. Now, even if you say, let's go be successful, I mean, the odds are still against you, but at least you're sort of thinking of that way and making sort of choices in that way and decisions in that way. And both paths are valid, and I'm not discrediting the value that starving artists play, but, you know, that has to be your choice. Like, make that a conscious choice as opposed to an accidental choice. Yes? So UX is super crazy critical and is not given enough weight by most game developers. So user experience, player research, user testing, all that kind of stuff, super valuable. And actually, GDC hosted a day-long UX summit. And the organizer of that event posted a summary of all the sessions with links to the videos, which are all free on the Vault, earlier this week on Gamasutra. So if you go to Gamasutra and plug in UX or UX Summit, you'll see the summary of all the stuff. Everyone in this room should go read that. I'm a huge fan of all the UX, sort of all of that stuff. And in fact, when we started Execution Labs, we only were hiring for 4 positions. One was sort of community and marketing, one was business intelligence and analytics, the other one was sort of an executive producer role to help sort of, you know, with budgeting and scheduling with all the teams, and the 4th was a UX director. Because we wanted to instill that mindset in all of the teams that we invested in, so they would sort of embrace the notion of UX and so on. Super important, and I believe in the context that you're trying to build a successful business, if you're not embedding UX and player research at the core of your company culture, you're going to have a lot of challenges. Yeah. So I didn't emphasize it enough, but super critical. Yeah. Are you an insurance salesman? You need to leave the room. No. Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, we're not really worried about that because it's much more about the team and the vision of the company. I mean, in an initial pitch, we're never saying, so what kind of insurance do you, like we're never doing that. But obviously when you're getting into the deeper contracting phases, then normally the studios are making reps and warranties, and that you have to make sure their paperwork is clean. Usually it's much more on the contract side than it is worrying too much about insurances. So if there's any lawyers in the room, this is good news for you. But and just as an FYI, because we're on that, I mean, for indies, the biggest one is the contract between the people and the company. So sometimes indies kind of go loosey-goosey, and everyone's kind of just working on a handshake, and there wasn't clear assignment of intellectual property rights and all this kind of stuff. And then if I come in and I want to invest in the company, but then there was an artist that you didn't get an IP assignment from, and the artist at any point can say, well, I didn't agree to nothing, I want all my art back, then what are, that's a big problem. So it's more just sort of making sure all the contract side is clean. The E&O stuff, I mean, that's what comes much later. Yeah. Was there, oh, we're out of time? All right. Okay, one more, yeah. Sweat equity. Yeah, so sweat equity is like the time, I guess, sort of referenced before, your own kind of personal time that you're investing in the company. Let's say you and your buddies are building a prototype, and you have no money, but you'll kind of just take your own time, and that's sort of sweat equity. So sweat equity is very valuable in that it sort of demonstrates commitment to the vision. Right, so the worst possible pitch that we'll ever get is, once you give me the money, then I'll quit my job and me and my buddies will go start working. Like you will never get that funding, and you'll go nowhere, right? Because as an investor, you have to take the risk on yourself first and put your own skin in the game for then me to say, okay, these guys are serious. They've already sort of, worked a bit and spent their time, and they've come up with something. I want to back this team. This is an exciting team. So sweat equity is valuable in that sense, that it enables you to, one, demonstrate that you're willing to commit yourself to this, crazy idea, but then also, assumedly, if you've spent some sweat equity, you've gotten to the next checkpoint. Right, so you're not starting from scratch with a drawing that says, here's my cool thing, give me $1 million and then I'll go do, right? So assumingly the sweat equity gets you to the first checkpoint, and then that allows you then to come talk to me or another investor, say, oh, well, great, you spent all that sweat equity to get to checkpoint 1 in the race. Okay, now I'll fill your gas tank to get you to the next checkpoint. So yeah, so it's valuable. I mean, from a practical sort of mathematical point of view, generally not. Like, I mean, we'll never sit down and say, well, what are you worth on the market? How many hours of sweat did you, like, so mathematically it's not, it's more the high level of, you committed, you got to the first checkpoint on your own steam, okay, now we can have a real conversation, and then we go from there. Awesome. All right, thanks everyone, enjoy the rest of the show.